Welcome to Figments of the Brain, a philosophy podcast recorded at the University of Cologne. Figments of the Brain is produced by Concept, the Cologne Center of Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian tradition. Every episode we pick a topic for a roundtable discussion among the members of Concept. Sometimes we also interview other philosophers on a selected topic. We welcome your feedback. To get in touch and learn more about the center, please visit www.concept-phil.de. That's www.concept-phil.de. We hope you enjoy our podcast.
So welcome everyone. Those who don't know me, my name is Sven Bernecker. I run the Concept Center, and we're very happy to welcome this Greco Fest here, this three-day event on the Epistemology of John Greco. It's hybrid, as I mentioned. Most speakers are actually going to be here, but 5 speakers will join online. So John Greco doesn't really need an introduction. You wouldn't be here if you didn't know, if you didn't appreciate his epistemology. But anyways, for those who are not familiar, let me tell you that John Greco is one of the foremost representatives of virtue epistemology. He has written a lot of interesting and seminal material in this field. He has, in his first book that came out in 2000 called Putting Skeptics in Their Place, he discussed the significance of skepticism and argues that we can most effectively deal with skepticism by adopting agent reliabilism. That was the label he used back then, and it's a form of virtue epistemology or virtue epistemological externalism. And then in this book, he also reflects on themes belonging to moral and religious epistemology, proposing a theory of moral perception that takes its cue from William Alston's work on religious perception. And then in his second book that came out in 2010 called Achieving Knowledge, he explores the idea that knowledge constitutes an achievement, as the title suggests, and thus is incompatible with just lucky believing. More specifically, he places knowledge within a broader normative framework of success through ability, and develops thereby a normative form of reliabilism. And in the third book, which came out in 2020 called Transmission of Knowledge, he specifically deals with social epistemology, including social religious epistemology, concentrating on the role of testament. And the idea there is that knowledge transmission is irreducible to knowledge generation, and epistemologists have mostly concerned themselves with knowledge generation, not so much with knowledge transmission. And knowledge transmission is explained in terms of information, distribution, and the essential feature of that is sharing of reliable information within an epistemic community. So you all know this, otherwise you wouldn't be here. The idea for this conference came from Valdemiro de Silva. So this is actually yet another collaboration between the Federal University of Brazil and the University of Cologne. So we have the format is called Philosophers Meets Critics. It's a purely online format, and many of you know it because you actually participated in it. Thank you for that. So this is now our first hybrid format as a collaboration between Cologne and Brazil. Valdemiro did the invitations, as you know, and thus set the program. We provided the organization and the funding. So the organizers of this conference are Valdemiro and Felipe de Rocha from Brazil. And then from the Cologne side, it is West Cisco, Luis, not in the room because he has to teach, Luis Rosa, Paul Silva, there, myself, and we couldn't do without the managerial competence of Sibel here. So a hybrid conference is challenging. We need to stick to the time frame. Each speaker has an hour and a half, but please don't take up all of the time because as you saw, we have not scheduled for transition and we need about 5 minutes for transition. So please only use an hour and 25 minutes at most. Keep your talks to 50 minutes maximum so that we have ample time for discussion. The speakers here in the room give their talks from where I'm standing or from this chair. If you want to pace up and down, that's fine. You may not be seen by the audience if you're too far on the right or too far on the left. And as long as you project your voice, it's fine. So stay within the focus of the camera, ideally. Then when we move to discussion mode, to Q&A, the video and the audio will be picked up by the owl, which is this little cone here. And you'll see what it does because you can follow it live here on the screen. And this is our first conference using this device, and hopefully it works. It promises to be as good as handing around a mic and as good as having a person in the room direct the camera to whoever is speaking. We'll see whether it keeps the promise. So the owl, the way the owl works is it detects sound first, and then it directs the camera to where the sound is coming from. Yeah, so if you start speaking, the owl will sometimes take a few seconds before it picks up where the sound is coming from, and then you'll see yourself on the screen. That's how it works. Okay, so you see the Wi-Fi is here. There are 3 bathrooms. One bathroom is 1 flight up. The second bathroom is in the entrance lobby to the right. And the third bathroom is through the dining area down the stairs. So it's a bit tricky, but I'm sure you'll find it. You all got PhDs. Tonight we'll have a conference dinner. Unfortunately, those who are joining online, you won't be part of that. The conference dinner is at Nini. It's a set menu. Water is included. Every other beverage is on you. What else? I think that's about it. So now, with this brief introduction, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce the guest of honor for this conference, John Greco, who's going to kick off this conference with a paper entitled How to Think About Knowledge in 40 Years or Less, but be aware it can't be longer than an hour and 25 minutes. So you have to condense. Okay, so I'm going to start your presentation. It's
yeah, that'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay, you want to come up?
Thank you so much.
And we need to turn this on. So you could scroll. Do you want to sit here? Yeah.
We'll just see if I have to scroll down. Great. Oh, well, thanks so much. I mean, thank you so much to Waldemaro and Sven the other organizers, the various organizations that are supporting this conference, and of course, to you all as well for being here. I know that I can't think of a greater privilege or honor to have so many excellent epistemologists here together to talk about some of the stuff that I've been thinking about and writing about over I said 40 years or less. I could have said 30 years or more. That maybe would have sounded a little better. Depends on whether you include graduate school or not. I was in graduate school with Ernie Souza, who was my dissertation director. And so I did start thinking about this stuff slightly after I met him. But we won't count the exact numbers. So what Valdemar asked me to do today is to sort of do a overview of the work that I've done over those years, and in effect, Sven gave my talk by beautifully summarizing the main ideas of the three books. So I'll just go into that in slightly more detail than Sven did, but you really did a nice job pulling out the main ideas there in such a short time. It kind of makes me wonder why it took 30 years or more. But okay, so so the first book is Putting Skeptics in Their Place. And actually, first I wanted to just talk about the conference poster for a moment. Can you go? Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Okay, this is going to take a while. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is the. I noticed that on the conference poster, if I'm not mistaken, the grip there on that ball is for a curveball, and you know the American expression, throwing someone a curveball. It means that you're throwing something unexpected at them, and maybe in a way that off balances them a bit because they're not expecting the curve. And so I was wondering if Valdemar was trying to tell me something with this poster. I'm not going to throw any curveballs here in this presentation. There's going to be like down the middle, but maybe you all have some curveballs for me later on. I wonder if this, if I do this, will it go faster? I don't want to ruin it.
Maybe because it's not slides, then we need to just do this, but then we cannot use that.
Yeah, okay, so you can go back to. Okay, what did you just do?
Yeah, just.
Oh, I see. Okay, perfect.
Because
perfect. Okay. Okay, so Putting Skeptics in Their Place is the first book, and the subtitle is The Nature of Skeptical Arguments in their role in philosophical inquiry. And the main idea there was I wasn't so much interested in skeptical people. They can be kind of annoying, but I was really interested in skeptical arguments. And skeptical arguments, I thought, had the structure of what Bertrand Russell thinks of as a philosophical problem generally. You start with premises or assumptions that look absolutely innocent in isolation, but then they get you somewhere that looks like, I don't want to go there. So now you've got this philosophical problem. How do I avoid, what assumption do I have to reject in order to not accept the unattractive conclusion, or maybe I do have to, in the end, accept the unattractive conclusions. That's the philosophical puzzle, right? So then you can think of skeptical arguments as heuristic devices for highlighting our pre-theoretical and seemingly innocent assumptions about things like the nature of knowledge, the nature of evidence, what makes for good evidence or good reasons. And then it shows us that there's, we have to rethink those pre-theoretical assumptions in order to explain how knowledge is possible, and especially how knowledge for beings like us is possible. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the book. As Sven explained, the takeaway from that book is that in order to be anti-skeptical, you have to go externalist. That if you accept internalist assumptions about the nature of knowledge, evidence, justification, reasonableness, you are going to be you're going to find yourself unable to reject anything in the skeptical argument. The skeptical argument is trading on internalist assumptions about knowledge, evidence, etc. So I'm not going to go into that so much, but I do want to say that the flip side of that is externalism does allow you to identify various assumptions in historically important skeptical arguments. So there's a whole family of arguments that I think of as no good inference arguments. And the basic idea of the argument, whether it be because of underdetermination or circularity, there's some problematic inference from appearance to reality, right? And so the philosophical project, if you accept that internalist perspective, is that you have to start with internally available evidence and then infer your way to beliefs about the external world. Well, externalism gives you a very nice way to avoid that whole problematic by simply saying, look, perception is not inference. It doesn't take us from internally available to premises via internally accessible inference rules, something like logical rules or quasi-logical rules, to the skeptical conclusion. Just don't think of perception that way. I mean, to the conclusion about the external world. Just don't think about perception that way. Perception involves a different kind of information processing. And what matters is not that perception is obeying the norms of good inference. So it doesn't matter if it doesn't respect the norms of good inference. It's not inference, and so it's not subject to those norms. It's a different kind of information processing which takes you reliably from perceptual inputs to beliefs about the external world. So you have a nice explanation. You don't only identify a problem with the skeptical argument, you have a nice explanation for why the argument is wrong where it is wrong. So in philosophy, we don't want to simply identify something we can reject or disagree with. We want a theoretical explanation for why it's correct to disagree there and reject that point in the skeptical argument. So an externalist theory, say a broadly reliabilist theory, but certainly a virtually reliabilist theory, would give an explanation for why that argument is wrong on that point. Similarly for regress arguments, a similar story. Not all reliable or virtuous cognitive processing is basing reasons on further reasons, and so you avoid the regress that way. Similarly for Hume's argument against induction or inductive knowledge. I'm going to just spend a minute on that because I do think it's an important point. So in Hume's notion is that my evidence is observed cases, but it's not simply observed cases. It's observed cases together with an assumption, a sort of implicit premise, if you will, that cases are a reliable indication of unobserved cases, or the future will resemble the past, or there's a regularity to nature, or something like that, right? And Hume's point was that in order to establish a kind of relationship between my evidence and my conclusions about observed cases, you need something like that connecting premise in there. Or otherwise, the observed cases would just be irrelevant to unobserved cases, at least from a logical point of view. And so you really need that connecting premise as part of your evidence. But then that raises the question, what's my justification for that premise? Because that premise is itself a contingent assumption about the world. It's not something that can be known by a priori reasoning because it's not a necessary truth. It's not something I observe to be true. It's something that if I know it all, it must be by observing past regularity and then inferring future regularity. And that, of course, is exactly the assumption we're trying to prove. And so the assumption gets us into a circle when you try to justify it, right? Well, what does a broadly reliable view do? It takes away this implicit assumption of Hume that you need that logical or quasi-logical relationship, some kind of necessary relation either deductive or probabilistic, but a necessary relation between my evidence and my conclusion. Induction works because it's in fact reliable, not because I can justify the assumption that observed cases are a reliable indication of unobserved cases, but because in fact they are. And so again, this is another kind of reliable cognitive processing that takes us from a certain kind of input to a certain kind of output, not only reliably so, but virtuously so in a way that we can explain later, okay? Okay, so that's, I think, enough about the skeptical argument. But what that first book establishes, the sort of lesson of that first book, is that only externalists can be anti-skeptical. And so an adequate theory of knowledge has to inhabit a certain logical space. And that you can think of as the takeaway of the first book. Now, the second book, Achieving Knowledge, addresses or tries to address what would be probably at that time the most persistent objection against an externalist view. A reliabilist view, but externalist views more generally, was in effect that they're not sufficiently, that they don't capture things like subjective justification, epistemic responsibility. You're making people just to be thermometers. They're just, you're leaving out agency in a way that just doesn't capture epistemic normativity. So the second book, Achieving Knowledge, a virtue theoretic account of epistemic normativity, is basically an attempt to provide an account of epistemic normativity that embraces the importance of agency, responsibility, subjective justification, etc., but in an externalist-friendly way. So basically, the argument of the book is that internalists have no claim to epistemic responsibility or subjective justification. They have no special claim to those notions. These can be understood in a perfectly good externalist way. And in fact, they can be understood better from an externalist perspective. And that's the the broadly Aristotelian virtue theoretic perspective of virtue epistemology. So basically, virtue theory gives us an externalist-friendly normative theory. It makes normativity safe for externalism, addressing that main kind of objection, right? So as you know, if not from my work, certainly from Ernie's work, that virtue epistemology thinks of knowledge as success grounded in virtue. In my terminology, success from ability. And what that does is it trades on an Aristotelian distinction between virtuous action and action from virtue. So a virtuous action is just something that a virtuous person would do, but it need not be from virtue, right? So I could be a vicious person, but do what a virtuous person would do in an instance, right? But a virtuous person acts from a disposition to act rightly or to act well. And so the Aristotelian notion of acting from virtue is this, of course, very broad normative notion, but it can be applied to the epistemic domain. So we can think of intellectual virtues and we can think of knowledge as success from not accident, not luck, but from intellectual virtue. So this broad approach, which makes knowledge just another kind of success from ability. I prefer the notion success from ability because one of the early problems with virtue theory is people kept reading too much into the notion of virtue. They kept reading virtue as moral virtue. and then claiming that, oh, there's no doxastic voluntarism and all sorts of things that would be appropriately at least on certain views, appropriate to think of action, but not belief. But of course, Aristotle made a distinction between moral virtues and intellectual virtues. It's just that we don't think of it that way. When we think of virtue, we think moral virtue or Aristotelian moral virtue. So I like the idea of success from ability, or Ernie's terminology now is success from competence, right? And that's the correct notion of virtue, ability or competence. Okay. That gives you a nice handle on the nature of knowledge. It gives you a nice handle on a variety of Gettier cases, where you could say, well, in the Gettier case, it's success, but it's lucky success. It's not success that's grounded in competence. In my terminology, it's not success that is explained by competence. So if you were to ask, why did the Gettier victim have a true belief, you'd say, well, it was just lucky, or there was a coincidence, or something like that. Whereas in the knowledge case, why does the person have a true belief? You would say, well, because it was grounded in excellent perception, or because it was grounded in good reasoning, or some other kind of competence or ability that would explain why the person hit the truth in this case. It would explain why they have a true belief rather than a false belief, or maybe no belief at all. It also gives a beautifully elegant explanation of the value of knowledge, because you can think of success from ability as an achievement, right? It's not a mere lucky success, it's an achievement in the sense of grounded in excellence or grounded in competence or ability. So when you win the game, the achievement in the strong sense is you won it from ability, right? Well, in general, we value achievements. We value achievements practically, but we also value them for their own sake. So there's a final value to achievements. So we can explain the value of knowledge just by thinking about the value of achievements more broadly, which is multidimensional, it's rich. And so you get this rich multidimensional understanding of the value of knowledge, including the final value of knowledge. And then, of course, it also does nicely with the scope of knowledge. And we already talked about skeptical arguments. And of course, a virtue theoretic account that I'm defending here does all the things I was talking about with the traditional skeptical arguments. But more than that, so that's the nature, value, and scope of knowledge, right? The traditional problems of epistemology. But it also addresses those problems from internalism, right? The Aristotelian account, the broadly Aristotelian account, gives you a nice account of subjective justification, right? To be subjectively justified is something like being justified from one's own point of view, something like that. So bracketing objective matters and concentrating on something like, well, just from the subject's point of view, what should they think, right? Well, a virtue theory gives you that, right? Because you can talk about a person acting from their own dispositions, acting from their own best efforts, grounded in their own best agency, whether or not that happens to be successful in a particular case, or whether or not that person is like invaded or stolen and a disembodied spirit, right? We can talk about how things look from the inside or how things are from the subjective point of view. We just don't put an internalist spin on that, because it's not internalist, right? It still has to do with how the person is disposed to think, being properly motivated, which is not reflectively accessible all the time. We can talk about a history of thinking, of good, excellent thinking. History is generally not reflectively accessible. So these are all sort of things that go into subjective justification, or closely related notion, epistemic responsibility, to think in a way that's epistemically responsible from an Aristotelian point of view, does take into account history. It does take into account motivation. It does take into account dispositions, all things that are typically not reflectively accessible. And so not things that can be easily understood from an internalist perspective. So you get a kind of you get a kind of updated take on what's wrong with internalism. It's not just that it leaves out things like reliability and safety and those sort of paradigmatically externalist notions. It also gives you a lousy account of subjective justification and epistemic responsibility, because it reduces those things to a kind of time slice and limited only to what is reflectively accessible at the moment. And the sorts of evaluations that we make of ourselves, both epistemically and also in the practical realm, if you want to talk about, responsibility with respect to action, those are just not familiar kinds of evaluation. At best, they're very limited and narrow and might arise on an occasion, but they're not the everyday evaluations that we make of ourselves, epistemically, practically, morally, etc. And so the internalist, from this perspective, isn't even doing a good job with what internalists are supposed to. That's supposed to be like their home field advantage, right? I think there is some interesting relationships here between the notion of epistemic responsibility and Nagel's discussion of moral responsibility, and how if you take luck seriously and you're taken by this Kantian notion of pure agency, where you're operating in a luck-free realm where the world need do you no favors. Nagel says the sphere of agency shrinks to an extensionless point because there's just so little in which of that luck, where the world needs to do you no favors. So I think that if you hold on to that really Kantian notion of epistemic of moral responsibility, you end up making moral responsibility problematic. I think it's a very close analogy to what goes on in the epistemic realm, where if you're looking for that realm of pure agency, where the world needs to do you no favors, you're making epistemic evaluation problematic as well. I mean, the externalist is rejecting that picture, that broadly Kantian picture, in favor of the broadly Aristotelian picture. And for those of you who want to say, well, that's not Kant, okay, I'll grant you that's not Kant, but that is Kantian, like Nagel. I mean, Nagel goes down that road, and as have many others. Okay. So the takeaway lesson from the second book is that the best theory of epistemic normativity is a virtue theoretic, broadly Aristotelian notion of normativity, as opposed to a Kantian or pseudo-Kantian internalist notion of normativity. Okay, so let's see how I'm doing on time. I guess I've spoken for about half an hour now, so I need about 15 more minutes. Yeah, okay, good. So the third book is The Transmission of Knowledge, and the transmission of knowledge doesn't have a subtitle, but if it were, I think in hindsight, the subtitle would have been something like Taking Social Epistemic Dependence Seriously in the Epistemology of Testimony. And by social epistemic dependence, I mean dependence on other persons or on other features of your social environment for your epistemic standing. So, so basically what I'm trying to do in that book is two things. First, I'm trying to offer a kind of general approach or a general framework in the epistemology of testimony that I mean to be broadly appealing, not just for virtue theory, but just a broadly appealing framework or approach in the epistemology of testimony, and that I think addresses a lot of the main problems in the epistemology of testimony. But then the second thing I want to do there, and it's really just devoted to one chapter, is show that this independently plausible, independently attractive framework is actually compatible with, really nicely wedded to, a virtue theoretic approach of epistemic normativity. By doing that, we answer what has become the next persistent problem for virtue epistemology, which is that it doesn't handle testimonial knowledge well, that it doesn't do well with various phenomena of social epistemic dependence. And you could see why that would be a criticism of virtue epistemology, because virtue epistemology says that knowledge and epistemic standing in general is grounded in the epistemic virtues of the believer or the knower. So it's individualistic in that sense. It's tracing epistemic standing to the onboard resources, as Anthony Cody would say, the onboard resources. Oh no, maybe that was Craig. I forget whose nice phrase that was. Craig, I think. The onboard resources of the individual. Whereas social epistemic dependence insists that no, our epistemic standing can't be a matter of, just what's going on in the individual. You have to broaden out to relationships to other persons and to broader features of the social environment. So in order to capture that idea, and really this, I suppose, let's forget about virtue epistemology for a minute and just think about the epistemology of testimony. And what I was struck with in the literature is that there was at least an implicit assumption that we should have a one theory fits all, or a one theory fits all cases theory of of testimonial justification and testimonial knowledge. And that's, on the face of it, that's a tall order, because think of the range of cases where we attribute testimony, justification, or knowledge. So on one end, you've got a police investigator interrogating a suspect, or a personnel director interviewing a job applicant. And there, it seems like you better have your guard up. You're not going to just believe what you're being told. You better have some sort of independent evidence that this person is telling the truth in this case, et cetera, et cetera. So it looks like testimonial justification is a lot like inductive justification. You use your past experience. You use past relevant experience, either in general and or with this particular individual, and you try to figure out what you can believe and what you can't believe that's coming at you now in this case, right? So that's a reductionist theory of testimonial justification and knowledge in the classical sense of reductionism, in which testimonial justification and knowledge reduces to inductive justification and knowledge. It's just a species of that familiar kind of epistemic phenomenon. It's a species applied to testimony and testifiers. Okay. Other end of the spectrum, a mom tells the 4-year-old that there's milk in the refrigerator. A teacher tells the second graders that Cologne is in Germany. I don't think the little 4-year-old is a little inductive reasoner, judging that, well, mom hasn't lied to me about this kind of thing in the past. People generally don't lie about milk in the refrigerator. What would her motivation be? I think there's more of a straightforward transmission of knowledge from the speaker to the hearer there. And so it looks like something is going on, something different is going on in the case where on one end of the spectrum, you have to have your guard up, and on the other end of the spectrum, there seems to be a kind of easy flow of information and knowledge. And I think the main idea is that there's a kind of cooperation in the latter cases. It's a context of cooperation that does not exist in the other cases. So to get that idea I make this distinction between the generation of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. And that distinction is already in the literature, but it's not quite the way that I mean it. In the literature, the transmission of knowledge is a very general notion. One person knows something, they interact a bit, and now the next person knows something. Now it somehow got transferred from the one person to the next person. I'm thinking about transmission in a special sense. I'm saying there's a distinctive phenomenon that I'm calling the transmission of knowledge that's occurring between the teacher and the student, or the mom and the child, or two friends discussing where they're going to go tonight for dinner. There's a cooperative context in which there's a transmission of knowledge there that's not going on in other testimony cases where you're outside of that appropriate context. So the way that I try to target that distinction between transmission of knowledge and the generation of knowledge is by introducing the idea of an epistemic community. So an epistemic community is a technical understanding of, it's basically just a group of people who are cooperating, so it's a cooperative context. A group of people are cooperating with respect to some set of shared information-dependent tasks. Shared tasks, shared practical tasks, or theoretical tasks that are information-dependent and cooperating together in that respect. So whenever you're doing that, you're forming an epistemic community in my technical sense, okay? So a research team would be an epistemic community, a classroom would be an epistemic community, a family would be an epistemic community, a friend group would be an epistemic community, each defined by some set of relevant information-dependent tasks in which they're cooperating and need to, in effect, manage the flow of quality information, okay? So to my mind, the distinction between the generation of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge doesn't really translate very well if you're just talking about individuals, because, you know, what's the difference between knowledge being transmitted to an individual and knowledge being generated in an individual? It seems like it's kind of like just two, maybe like one is a version of the other or something like that. So that distinction between transmission and generation doesn't really make quite sense on the individual level, but it does make sense on the level of communities. Okay, because once you go to communities, now you have a distinction between information distribution and information, oops. Let me see if I might not need to. Yeah, can you just make that slide come up?
You need this one. Like
Yeah,
this?
there we go. Perfect.
Okay, because that's
Yeah. So think of the inside the circle as an epistemic community, and outside the circle is information coming in. Okay. So within the context of epistemic community, you can make a very easy distinction between information acquisition and information distribution. Okay. So one task of an epistemic community is to acquire quality information that needs to be, you know, used among us. And so you could think of like, you know, a bunch of campers, they witness a vicious dog, one person witnesses a vicious dog outside the camp and then reports, and then, you know, now that information through perception is being acquired by one person in the epistemic community. But now, besides information acquisition, you've also got the task of information distribution. So once that person gets that important information, they have to distribute it to the other people who need it within the epistemic community. So obviously, we're going to think of knowledge generation as devoted to the information acquisition task, and we're going to think of knowledge transmission as devoted to the information distribution task. And the idea here is that you would expect there to be two sets of norms answering to the different tasks, right? So the central function of the information acquisition task is quality control. You want good quality information coming into the epistemic community because it's going to be used for action, right? The central task of information distribution is access, to get it to the people who need it. And so the norms governing acquisition ought to be different than the norms governing distribution, simply because those two functions, have different goals, right? And so different norms associated with achieving those goals. So you already get a kind of anti-reductionist account of transmission just on this level of theoretical generality, right? The norms of knowledge transmission would not be expected to reduce to the norms of knowledge generation, two sets of norms answering to two different tasks, okay? And so the idea is that in the appropriate context of cooperation, knowledge transmission respects the norms of information acquisition, distribution, whereas knowledge generation respects the norms of information acquisition. And now the next point is that testimony can serve both of those functions, because sometimes the speaker is outside the epistemic community and sometimes the speaker is inside the epistemic community. So if the speaker is outside, well, let's picture that as the job interview situation, and the epistemic community is a corporation. So in the first case, you've got testimony between the speaker and the hearer. Here is in the role of information acquisition, and so subject to generation norms. This guy is doing quality control here. He has to be a good inductive reasoner, perhaps, right? But that's different. I think the norms governing this transaction are different when the personnel director goes to his boss and reports what he said. She doesn't have the same attitude towards him as a speaker as he should have towards him as a speaker. And so again, the testimonies can play either the information acquisition role or the information distribution role within the context of an epistemic community. Okay, so I think I should finish up fairly quickly here. Well, how much time do you think I have? 5 minutes, okay, good. All right, so I just want to end with my account of that transmission, the transmission of knowledge. And my account is going to feature the speech act of telling. So here's Lizzie Fricker on the speech act of telling. And I agree with everything she says here, okay? So what she says here is that tellings, I guess that's a little hard for you to read, so tellings are a subset of assertion. And tellings are a subset of assertion. In a paradigm of judicious telling, the teller rightly takes herself to know that P and seeks to share her knowledge with her intended audience. So the idea here is that the speech act of telling, as opposed to assertion in general, the speech act of telling is dedicated to the transmission of knowledge. It's dedicated to sharing knowledge. And if you don't want to call it telling, call it something else. The point is that there is a speech act that's dedicated to sharing knowledge, okay? Telling is the proprietary linguistic means, often the only practical way of achieving this. In other words, sharing knowledge. And almost always by far the easiest of letting someone else know what one already knows oneself. The illocutionary act of telling is achieved when there is uptake the intended audience correctly grasps the content and force of the speech act, recognizing that she is being told that P. It is consummated, the speech act is consummated when the audience trusts the teller, forming the belief that beyond her say so. And then Lizzie also says, telling is a social institution for the spreading of knowledge. So I think she's exactly right there. She goes off the rails quite soon after that, but she's exactly right there. So what I like about what I see in this understanding of the Speech Act is an instance of joint agency. So in joint agency, there's a shared intention that we're doing something together. In this case, it would be sharing knowledge. And there's a kind of common understanding of that joint intention. So you're trying to do something with me. I understand that you're trying to do something with me. And then we sort of proceed accordingly to achieve that shared intention in the context of this common understanding. So the Speech Act theory is not always understood as an instance of joint agency, understanding speech acts as in the context of joint agency, but things like promising, betting, telling, commanding, they're all any number of speech acts in which there's got to be a kind of understanding of the intention of the speaker, and then a cooperation that will result in appropriate uptake or consummation of the Speech Act. Okay, so I want to understand the transmission of knowledge within that context. That gives us very quickly, that gives us a virtue theoretic account of the transmission of knowledge. We can now put this in the context of a virtue theory. We can say that knowledge that P is generated in S, if S is believing the truth regarding P, is attributable to S's competent cognitive agency. So knowledge is generated when your believing the truth can be attributed, explained by your own competent agency. Knowledge is transmitted from a speaker to a hearer when the hearer's believing the truth is attributable to S's, the speaker's and the hearer's joint competent or competent joint agency. So in the old view, all knowledge is grounded in the virtuous or competent agency of the knower. In this view, the transmission of knowledge is different from that. It's not the testimonial knowledge, at least when it's transmitted knowledge, is explained by manifests attributable to not simply the virtuous cognitive agency of the knower, but the virtuous joint agency of the speaker and hearer cooperating. Okay? And so this book was on the transmission of knowledge. I suppose that there are cases of the generation of knowledge which are also grounded in competent joint agency, right? So you might work together in the notion of working together that's appropriate to shared or joint agency and come to generate knowledge, like in a research team discovering something new. But this book isn't about that. It's using the notion of joint agency and virtuous joint agency or competent joint agency to explain how knowledge gets transferred from one person to another. So again, and I think this might be a place where Ernie and I disagree. I think this is a change in view, okay? I always took traditional virtue epistemology as grounding knowledge in the virtue of the individual. And what I'm claiming here is that to appropriately understand this phenomenon of social epistemic dependence, this dependence on other persons, where our epistemic standing is not just grounded in our own efforts, but is more distributed between other persons and to the social environment more generally. I think that you need to bring in this notion of joint agency, But now what's explaining the knowledge, or what the knowledge is grounded in, it's not simply my part in that joint agency. It's in the joint agency. So it's true that it's true that in testimonial knowledge, and especially in transmitted knowledge, it's still true that my own virtues are manifested because I had to play my appropriate part in the joint agency. But the implication of my individual virtues are really parasitic on the more primary explanatory notion, which is the joint agency. It's the virtuous joint agency that is explaining the knowledge or explaining the true belief. So it's true that the knowledge still manifests my virtues in a sense, but only because it manifests the virtuous joint agency in which I played a part. And notice that in cases of joint agency, the hearer might play a very small role. It might be just the role of understanding the speech act and sort of, doing what, when the child gets knowledge from the mom that there's milk in the refrigerator, the child is doing something, but not very much, right? And when the student is learning from the teacher, the child is doing something, but not very much. So what's really explaining that knowledge that the child ends up with, or the student ends up with, is not just their participation. The primary explanation is that this cooperation, this virtuous cooperation that allowed the knowledge to be transferred from the speaker to the hearer. So I think that's a different view. I think Erin's going to disagree with that. So I think just one last thought. And this is just an added thought, because I don't think I had this distinction as clear in my mind when I wrote the book as I believe I do now. And that's the difference between anti-reductionism in the epistemology of testimony and anti-individualism in the epistemology of testimony, okay? So the way I'm thinking of reductionism, the reductionist says that testimonial knowledge and justification simply reduces to inductive knowledge and justification. It's just a species of inductive knowledge and justification. An anti-reductionist denies that. And so it's just, reductionist, you say it's all, a reductionist is an inductivist. An anti-reductionist says, no, it's not just induction. Okay. You can deny that and still be an individualist. Okay, so take a virtue theoretic view, for example, where there's a dedicated cognitive capacity, a dedicated cognitive ability to evaluating testifiers and their testimony. So that's the view that I used to want to defend. That, well, I'm not a reductionist because, there's a special virtue that's dedicated especially to the evaluation of speakers and their testimony. It's not induction, it's a separate cognitive module, so to speak, which itself is an intellectual virtue. Well, that's still individualism, because it's saying that the knowledge can be explained just in virtue of my own onboard cognitive capacities. For anti-individualism, you need to somehow understand that my epistemic standing depends more on, in a different way, on a broader supervenience base, so to speak. The epistemic standing isn't supervening just on my capacities, it's supervening on my capacities in relationship with my social environment, and in this case, with other persons. So this notion of the virtuous joint agency as explaining testimonial knowledge, it's not just anti-reductionist, it's also anti-individualistic. And that's what I was going for. And I won't defend this, but my last comment will be that the motivation is the same as in the first book, to be anti-skeptical. I think that if you want to be anti-skeptical, you have to adopt anti-individualism in the epistemology of testimony and elsewhere as well. I think not just in testimony, but elsewhere. I think just as we are social animals practically, we're also social animals intellectually. And in order to understand the epistemic standing of beings like us, you have to understand how our epistemic standing is robustly dependent on other persons in the social environment. And so to capture all the knowledge that beings like us have, you have to be not only externalist, not only anti-reductionist, but also anti-individualist. Okay, thank you.